if you go back, from post Margaret Thatcher to Major to Blair to Brown, Cameron, and then obviously May, and until you get to Boris, no prime minister's had to deal with a pandemic of the scale that we had to deal with, almost like entering a third world war with a virus. Before that, he had to deal with Brexit and actually get the country to a place where we could be at peace with ourselves and move on and have a very different positive relationship with Europe. And then, of course, the crisis and inflation and the war on our continent. So you've had, Brexit, pandemic, war on continent. You can't be more consequential in your period in office.
We are no strangers to the political memoir here on Times Radio. Having left government, it's not unusual for politicians to want to let loose on the page and set the record straight as they see it. Nadhim Zahawi, former Chancellor and former chair of the Tory party, however, has focused on his early life and journey to politics as much as his time in office. The book is called The Boy from Baghdad, and we can speak to Nadhim Zahawi now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
This is a book of many, many parts, Nadhim Zahawi, and some of the reviews actually have said that they find the kind of the early parts of perhaps the stuff that we don't know that much about, the stuff about living in Iraq, absolutely fascinating, because this is the stuff that we didn't know that much about. So can you explain then why you decided to get into politics? Your family fled Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. You came to the UK when you were 12, I think. You did quite a few things, including selling T-shirts outside Wimbledon.
That's right.
You co-founded YouGov, but why on earth get into politics?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Asma. It's great to be with you. The book began initially as Neil Blair, my agent, asked me whether I would think about writing about my early life when I was still in cabinet, and I had to get Simon Case to agree to that and leave the politics out. And then, of course, I left cabinet very, publicly, and I went back to HarperCollins and said, look, why don't I take another year and do the book sort of with the sort of vaccine and everything else in as well. So I hope people enjoy, I guess, both halves of the book. Why did I get into politics? I had zero interest in politics up until uni, where I went to University College London and I read chemical engineering. First week, freshers' fair, I'm walking into the University of London Union. I was about a third of the size I am today. I was a very slim student in those days. And a man was handing out, a big man, as I recall him, the Socialist Workers' Party magazine at the door, which I had no idea what it was, to be honest. And I just reluctantly declined his offer. I just went, no, thank you. At which point he was so aggressive that he decided that I was close to sort of physically accosting me as to why I wouldn't take it, especially someone of my color.
Oh.
That really offended me. And I thought the best way to get back at him, other than, to fight him physically, was to go and find out what the other side thinks. So I went to the little trestle table with the Conservative Collegiate Union, as it was called, and I sort of, asked a few questions, and then very quickly realized that actually, what my party stood for, was freedom. I just basically, as you said, left Iraq at the age of 12, fleeing a terrible dictator, opportunity, and I signed up. And that's where the sort of political bug sort of bit me. I then joined my local association, initially in Kingston, then in Putney. And then they said, would you consider standing for councillor? And I did, and I won my seat.
Yeah. So Nadhim Zahawi, if you hadn't had that that interaction with the man trying to get you to read the Socialist Worker, or wherever it was, what do you think? Do you think your politics would have been conservative with a small c or a big C anyway?
I suspect so. I mean, I've been a sort of natural entrepreneur. You mentioned YouGov. I talked about the failure, Alan Hinckley Limited. I like to take ideas from inception all the way through to delivery. I think that's what I brought to government when I did everything from the ventilator challenge, where we had to basically build 30,000 ventilators in about 12 weeks, to the vaccine deployment, where we went from no infrastructure, no real ability to deliver a vaccine at that scale, to getting to closer to 1 million doses a day. protecting the nation. So my instinct was always to build, whether in business or in political delivery or public service. So I suspect I would have done so. I may have not ended up being in Parliament at all. It was one of those things that sliding doors,
Yeah.
asthma. But
Well, I
I pinch myself in the morning. When I shaved my head this morning to get ready for this interview, I thought, how did I get from, I talk about it in the book. My cousin was taken hostage, or not hostage, prisoner of war in Iran for about 12 years, where we lost touch with him. And he's my first cousin, and that could have so easily have been me. And I ended up becoming second Lord of the Treasury in what I think is the greatest country on earth.
Now, this I find really fascinating, because you said earlier that you felt that some people, there was a perception that because you were not white, that you should be left wing, and you kind of railed against that. This narrative of the boy from Baghdad made it to Westminster, etc., is fascinating. But you do talk about in the book feeling that you didn't fit in for whatever reason, not necessarily because of your ethnicity, but because you hadn't gone the preferred route for someone who was in politics. And I just want to read this bit just very, very quickly. This is about David Cameron's government. I had been privately educated for the latter part of my schooling, but as a teenager, my copybook was heavily blotted, and I wasn't the kind of clever that would have taken me to Oxford or Cambridge. I wasn't serious enough about life, and I hadn't been schooled in the right way to get me there. I knew I was going to end up being someone. At times, it did feel like I wasn't good enough for the Cameron team. And if I'm honest, I found some of them a little arrogant. So what do you think that kind of not being good enough was?
I think because I wasn't a sort of Westminster creature where I'd sort of been a special advisor or in that clique of people that were around David and George. That I came in as someone who was an engineer, then a founder of YouGov. From business, thinking that as long as I just did what I did well, people would recognize it. And I worked out very quickly that's not how it works. And one of my colleagues, I remember saying to me, look, you've got to start managing up much better. And the sort of my intake, the 2010 intake, some of them very quickly found a patron like George Osborne, and they accelerated through the ranks. And I felt I was always the one on the outside, not being able to sort of penetrate this sort of this group. And I just felt that maybe it's just my I don't happen to have gone to Oxbridge. I don't belong to the same sort of intellectual circle as they did. And I guess most people feel the same way. I always remember a lunch I had with Michael Portillo before entering Parliament, even, and I remember him saying that when he was in cabinet, walking into the cabinet room with his papers ready to present, he always felt that that he was just going through the motions, whereas behind the door on the left-hand side, the real big decisions were made. So even when you get to cabinet, you still feel like you're an outsider. We have to always, I guess, remember most people have no idea how you even become a member of Parliament, and that's why I think, in many ways, the challenge for the previous government and now this government is how do you relate what you do in government to people's lives?
Yeah, well, we'll move on to that in a second. Now, you are obviously very proud of this, boy from Baghdad making good idea. And it is something to be proud of. And you did enjoy some success, particularly as vaccines minister. But it ended in pretty bad, in a bad way, really. I think you'd probably admit when you were sacked because you failed to disclose that your tax affairs were being investigated. How much of a blow was that to you and to your family?
Really difficult, and I talk about it in some detail in the book. And for my wife, my children, for myself, and in the end, I own my own mistake. I should have been much more explicit in my declaration. I talk about specifically me declaring that that there was questions about my tax affairs and the investigation. I should have been much more explicit that although the final verdict was I found to be careless, which is a category of tax penalty attached to that. Uh, uh, I should have been much clearer on my ministerial declaration, because ministers are rightly held, because of the Nolan principle, to a much higher standard. And although I did declare that I had a settlement with HMRC, I didn't actually go into the details of the settlement, including the fine, which led to my obviously leaving government. And I talk very, very explicitly about the emotions I had to go through, having to reflect on what happened in my life, and of course people that I was close to throughout my political and business career as well.
Um, let's talk about Conservative prime ministers, of which there have been many recently. You'd probably admit, Nadhim Zahawi, too many. I'm paraphrasing here, but David Cameron, a bit detached and arrogant. Theresa May, a woman of few words and someone I found difficult to read. Liz Truss, ideologically bold, but perhaps a little bit misled. Sunak, clever, but not your guy. But Boris Johnson, now he was your guy, wasn't he? The most consequential prime minister of his generation. But this was also a deeply flawed individual.
And that's one of the themes of the book. There are no superhumans in politics. You know, people, not you, Asma, but many of your colleagues are sometimes in danger of writing headlines about politicians, having to never ever admit an error or make a mistake. And I think, Boris gave me my biggest break in politics. He made me business and industry minister, and then vaccine deployment minister, and then Secretary of State for Education, and then Chancellor of the Exchequer. The reason I say he's the most consequential is because if you go back, from post Margaret Thatcher to Major to Blair to Brown, Cameron, and then obviously May, and until you get to Boris, no prime ministers had to deal with a pandemic of the scale that we had to deal with, almost like entering a third world war with a virus. Before that, he had to deal with Brexit and actually get the country to a place where we could be at peace with ourselves and move on and have a very different positive relationship with Europe. And then, of course, the crisis and inflation and the war on our continent. So you've had, Brexit, pandemic, war on continent. You can't be more consequential in your period in office. And I remember sitting in cabinet where we were getting a briefing that Zelensky's probably got 3 days, at best fortnight, and the prime minister making a very brave decision, very fast, to back Zelensky immediately. That to me, that's a pretty consequential prime minister.
Okay. I mean, obviously, people have very strong views on Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
The Conservatives currently are in quite a difficult position because they are blamed by many people, and they were at the ballot box, for the economy, for the NHS, etc. But they also have to be an effective opposition. So how do the Conservatives, do they need to acknowledge that they actually got things wrong a bit more, while at the same time being an effective opposition? Because, people's memories have not faded yet. It's only been 8 weeks, I think. What about the tone? From what you've heard from the current opposition, the Conservatives, are they getting the tone right?
So the simple answer to your question about admitting mistakes is a yes, a resounding yes. We have to be very, very open and honest with people about the errors we made. I stood in 97, and I think Black Wednesday had happened 4 years before, yet the nation still didn't forgive us for that, for the shock to their home finances that we caused to their mortgages. And I think we've just suffered a similar type of result here, compounded by something much worse, I think, than in 97, although there were divisions in 97, is much deeper divisions in the party. When my party begins to talk about itself as 5 families, what message does that send out to your listeners, to your
too many families? I think that's what we said at the time. It's just why are there 5 families? But that's being a broad church, isn't it, Nadhim Zahawi? That's what we were constantly told.
And one that is united, right? Politics is a team game. You put on the shirt and you play for the team. You don't undermine the team. We were basically forming a circular firing squad and attacking each other every day. making Keir Starmer's job very simple, which is all they had to
But
do,
but, but
was
Nadhim
just look
Zahawi,
competent.
but were you part of that? Because you asked Boris Johnson to resign, and then you decided to support him when it looked like he was going to make a comeback.
So when I asked him to resign, was, and again I go into some detail in this in the book,
Mm.
the day before. We were losing a minister every half an hour,
Yeah.
and we got to a stage by the evening where it was almost impossible to form a functioning government. And I went to see him to say face to face, look, I will always work hard as your chancellor. I will do everything in my power. I was planning the big economic vision for what is Johnsonian economics looks like beyond the pandemic and beyond the war on our continent. But we're not going to have enough time. And in that meeting, he didn't want to go. I had to sort of reflect overnight, and then I wrote him the letter to say, look, I just don't think it's sustainable. And he actually agreed with me because he rang me afterwards. I thought he was going to sack me. And he said, I want you to stay on as my chancellor. We've got a lot to do in the few months we've got that summer.
Mm.
And actually admitted himself that the day before he was probably wrong to try and resist what was clearly happening. And the line I said to him in our meeting, which is that the herd has stampeded, and it was too late. I still think Boris is an extraordinary politician who did unite the right and win an 80-seat majority in 2019. We mustn't forget that.
Mm.
But whoever becomes leader of the party, their biggest challenge at this stage, of course, is to energize the party on policy and be a very, very effective opposition. But the first thing we've got to do is unite and stop this constant undermining of one another that goes on in, as you know, Asma, in sort of private briefings by SPADs or by actually politicians themselves against one another.
But do you think that can actually be stopped? I know there's this yellow card system currently, during the Conservative leadership process. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure how you put that cat back in the bag. Really, I mean, how do you? I don't quite understand how do you expect people to behave a different way to which they have got used to behaving over the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. I mean, is that not just wishful thinking?
No, I don't think so. I don't. It took Labour 14 years to get its act together and to unite and fight an election successfully. And I have to say, I have no problem learning from others. When Keir Starmer decided to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn, people like John McDonnell then drew the line. They didn't cross that line, and party discipline was reinstalled in the Labour Party. And I think those are the sort of lessons we have to learn. Otherwise, we will be irrelevant. Other political parties, much more organised than ourselves, will fill that space. And I think that's a very dangerous place for my party. The natural party government, the last 100 years, we've governed for 80% of the time. I still think both the activists, the membership, the councillors around the country are serious people doing serious work for the
Okay.
party.
And
And I think for their sake, they deserve a leadership that can unite and fight Labour and hold Labour to account.
finally, are you finished with politics?
Yes, I am. I am happily retired and enjoying spending much more time with my family. I've got all sorts of ideas. I've just taken on chairmanship of a very successful online business. We have 4 million customers, which we sell about 1.7 billion pounds worth of everything other than groceries and books, I think. But in a very successful business, but that needs also some financial restructuring, which I am focusing on at the moment.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for talking to us on Times Radio Breakfast. That is Nadhim Zahawi, former Chancellor, former chair of the Tory party. He's written a memoir. It's called The Boy from Baghdad, and it's published today.